Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. Coming up on tonight's show. Following the truce deal between Ethiopia's government and Tigray forces, the country looks ahead to peace and reconciliation. But many scars from 2 years of war may run too deep. We speak to Amnesty International about the voiceless victims of gender-based violence from the war in Ethiopia. Then, in the heart of the climate crisis, African countries are feeling the heat. Rwanda has already seen its fair share of weather disasters, but a new project plans to mitigate the impact. Welcome news for the nation's vulnerable tea industry. And Kenya's worst drought in 4 decades has led to the death of hundreds of animals in the country's preserves. But while Nairobi seeks to enforce its conservation efforts, authorities say more loss of life could be on the way. Thanks for joining us again. In a momentous week for Ethiopia, the country begins to pick up the pieces after 2 years of bloodshed and war. The truce deal signed by government and rebel Tigray forces on Wednesday brings an end to hostilities, which have seen hundreds of thousands killed and millions displaced. But there's another aspect of the war which is set to leave long-lasting psychological damage for its victims: gender-based violence. Earlier, I was joined in the studio by Amnesty International's Senior Crisis Response Advisor, Donatella Rovera, who unpacked these atrocities committed in Tigray.
Sexual violence has been very much a defining element. From the very first days of the conflict, all the parties involved, so Ethiopian government forces, Eritrean government forces who were acting alongside Ethiopian government forces, and a whole host of militias allied with government forces. From the very first day, they raped women by the dozens and dozens. The rapes were often accompanied by insults, slurs, threats that showed that this violence was really intended to target both the victims and their entire communities. To humiliate, to terrorize the community. So, for example, they would tell women, this is what you deserve, what you people deserve. The rapes were also often accompanied by a lot of gratuitous brutality, mutilations. Women and girls as young as 15 were kept sometimes for days and weeks, in what really amounted to sexual slavery. Very often the rapes were perpetrated by multiple perpetrators, like sometimes 3, 4, 5, 10 men raping the same woman, the same girl, repeatedly over a period of hours and days. And this was something that was happening day in, day out from the first days of the conflict. Proper investigations need to be carried out so that the victims can obtain justice, and the perpetrators must be held accountable, because these are serious war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed by both sides, because Tigrayan rebels also carried out the same sort of abuses, rapes and sexual violence against Amhara women when they reached the Amhara regions. So whilst most of the cases that we know of were perpetrated by government forces and their allied, the Tigrayan rebel forces also committed similar abuses. So it's very important that both sides are investigated. It's also crucial that investigators like Amnesty International, like other international human rights organizations, the Independent Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations, that we are all given access to the area so that we can monitor the situation and carry out investigations on the ground ourselves. And equally, the humanitarian aid that is so desperately needed, especially by the survivors of sexual violence, which has been blocked by the government of Ethiopia, that must be allowed to resume, because these victims and these survivors, not only they have endured the most atrocious horrendous crimes, but they have also been denied the medical care and the humanitarian aid that is so crucial for their recovery.
Here are some other headlines from across the continent. Following ongoing protests against military rule, Sudan's factions have broken a deadlock with talks over the drafting of a new constitution. The new draft provides for a transitional civilian-led authority with oversight over the armed forces, who must then in turn exit politics after signing the deal. But that agreement faces large opposition from Islamists who served under former President Omar al-Bashir. Then Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has once again vowed not to impose a national lockdown to contain the spread of Ebola. Museveni has instead urged citizens to be more vigilant and observe health measures. The death toll from the highly contagious disease currently stands at 64 in the country, according to the World Health Organization. And representatives of the African Union met with foreign ministers from the G7 on Friday as the summit continued in the western German city of Münster. Kenya and Ghana's foreign ministers are also in attendance for discussions centering on the security situation in the Sahel and Horn of Africa, food and energy security, as well as the climate crisis. Well, speaking of that climate crisis, with countries set to gather in Egypt on Sunday for the COP27 climate change conference, pressure is growing for tougher action to tackle global warming. In many cases, it's developing countries, though, which bear the brunt of the effects of the changing climate. Rwanda is one of those examples where large-scale flooding has destroyed hundreds of acres of tea trees, vital to the economy, as Clément Di Roma explains.
Alphonsine Mukawego is one of the first victims of climate change in northern Rwanda. In 2012, hundreds of tea trees were destroyed during violent floods.
This tea is worthless, except for the fire.
For the last 10 years, this mountainous region has been through many natural disasters. 200 hectares have already been destroyed. Weather extremes threaten Rwanda's green gold, tea exports bringing around 100 million euros each year.
15 years ago, the rains became more intense. They caused floods. Before, the water levels were good for growing tea. But afterwards, the floods destroyed all the plantations.
In 2019, Rwanda started a green project in Gicumbi to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Alphonsine had no choice but to move to the very top of this nearby hill. 50 hectares were planted here by the government to show farmers that mountain tea is a better and a less vulnerable crop.
The farmers, they will benefit the income from the tea. There is no issue of flooding. There is no issue of erosion. They can harvest more than 3 times per month without any interruption.
35,000 tons come out each year from the 18 factories in the country. 95% of it is exported to the international market. Tea provides Kigali with essential revenue, so the government wants to encourage farmers to move to the hills as quickly as possible. The National Meteorological Agency forecasts more violent rains in the years to come.
In the west and in the north of the country, we've noticed an increase of these extreme events. The minimum temperature is increasing in this region and at the national level.
Since 1970, Rwanda's average temperature has increased by 1.7 degrees, further proof that despite emitting the least, it is African countries that stand to suffer the most from the climate change in the coming years.
And more on extreme weather events in Africa. Kenya is another country experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. Authorities now say hundreds of wild animals, including endangered species like zebras and elephants, have died since February because of lack of water and food. Laurent Berstecher has the story.
They are the other victims of Kenya's extreme drought. The country says hundreds of wild animals, spanning some 14 species, have died of hunger and thirst since the start of the year.
Wildebeests, we've lost a total of 512 animals. Common zebra, we've lost a total of 381. Our elephants, we've lost a total of 205.
After 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, the Horn of Africa is currently experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. The crisis is affecting nearly half of Kenya and has pushed millions of people into extreme hunger. The widespread death of endangered wildlife now represents a fresh blow for the country, which has in recent years doubled down on conservation efforts in an attempt to develop ecotourism. But it's also a warning sign that the situation could get even worse for many Kenyans.
If the elephants can die, how about the cows, which are primarily grazers? So the pastoral communities are really in there of another catastrophic situation whereby we are not only losing livestock, but we can also be losing people.
Around 1.5 million cattle are thought to have died in Kenya since the start of the year, while at least 4 million people have been affected by the drought, nearly 10% of the country's population.
Well, that's all that we have here on Eye on Africa, but there's plenty of news coming up on France 24. From me, it's bye for now.
War has once more reared its head in Europe, recalling the darkest hours of our history.
Kiev is still about 30 kilometers away.
France 24 is providing constant coverage of events in Ukraine. Our teams on the ground and in the studio will keep you informed of all the latest developments. Stay informed, stay aware.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.